Even though hunters wear bright orange vests and hats, accidents still happen. The problem is trying to figure out which shootings are accidents and which are not. In Colorado, investigators used forensic metallurgy, a piece of string and geology, to see whether one man's death was an accident or murder. Here, thousands of big game hunters flock to the Uncompahgre National Park in western Colorado.
Elk, deer, bear, mountain lion up in that area. So it's kind of a pretty area, very remote.
On the second day of hunting season in 1995, Doug Kyle was relaxing in his camp when he heard a woman screaming. She said she found her husband lying on the ground near their camp. He had been shot in the chest.
I could tell that, he was deceased. And I looked at her and told her, I said, ma'am, I'm sorry. I said, but he's gone.
The victim was 48-year-old Bruce Dodson. His wife, Janice, said she went looking for him when he didn't return to their camp.
Right after this happened, or I was being told anyway, that it was a hunting accident.
He's a man walking upright through grass 4 inches tall. He's got a hunter orange cap on. He's carrying a rifle. The only thing that could have happened in this world would have been a 1 in a million chance of somebody a canyon over shooting at an animal and a stray bullet hitting him.
Bruce's body was sent to the medical examiner, Dr. Tom Canfield, for an autopsy.
Bruce worked for me. He was a medical technologist in the Delta Hospital, and I knew him very well, both at a professional and a personal level.
The autopsy results were startling. Bruce hadn't been shot once, but 3 times.
Well, I was able to determine, one, that they were distant range gunshot wounds. That is, they were fired from a significant distance.
One shot was a superficial wound that went through his hunting vest and grazed his back.
The wound that went through his vest but did not cause significant damage to him probably was the first shot.
I believe he then took the vest off to see what had happened.
He would have turned in that direction and probably yelled out of fear, hey, I'm not a deer. I'm not an elk. Hey, I'm over here. Yeah, don't shoot.
Bruce was shot a second time while waving his vest in the air. It entered his chest and exited under his right arm.
Mr. Dodson may have tried to crawl away when the last shot was fired.
The third and fatal shot entered his back in an upward trajectory and was found in Bruce's lung. It was badly deformed, but by its size, identified as a .243 caliber round.
The only landmark we really had to go on was the base design.
Janice Dodson had been hunting on this trip too, but this bullet did not come from her rifle or Bruce's.
So it couldn't have been Bruce's rifle that killed him. Couldn't have been Janice's rifle that killed Bruce Dodson.
But Dr. Canfield was convinced the shooting was no accident.
I was able to conclude, beyond a reasonable doubt and with reasonable medical certainty, that Bruce died from multiple gunshot wounds, and it was clearly a homicide.
The autopsy revealed Bruce Dodson had been hit with 3 shots.
We didn't know if maybe we had some maniac in the woods with a rifle, just randomly shooting someone.
Investigators found a clue in a fence post near Bruce's body. It was a fresh bullet hole. So they used a string to perform a trajectory analysis.
We began where the victim was located, at the approximate height of the wounds, and went back to the fence post. And then continued to string that back toward the area that the shot was fired.
In a clump of bushes 80 yards in front of the fence post, investigators found a .308 caliber shell casing. To find the bullet that went through Bruce's chest, investigators searched the area in the straight line path beyond where Bruce was standing. With a metal detector, miraculously, they found a .308 caliber round.
At the end of that string was the bullet. I mean, it was stroke of luck, stroke of luck.
This raised the possibility that there were two shooters. Since a .308 caliber round passed through Bruce's body and a .243 caliber round killed him.
None of that forensic evidence added up. The analysis of the bullet in Bruce's body didn't match any of the evidence that we had picked up at the scene so far.
Neither Bruce nor his wife Janice owned a rifle capable of firing either caliber round. A look into the victim's background revealed that Bruce Dodson and Janice had been married for only 3 months.
Bruce said that Janice wanted to go on this hunting trip. He didn't really want to go, but to make her happy, he agreed to go.
Family members were appalled at the way Janice behaved after Bruce's death.
She threw everything that my brother owned away, had his dog put to sleep, sold his horse, took his name off the mailbox like the next day.
Even more alarming was the fact that Janice's ex-husband, J.C. Lee, was camping less than a mile away from Bruce and Janice at the time of the murder.
He was camped 3/4 of a mile from the Dotson camp where John Bruce Dotson was murdered. So he was quite suspicious to us, and we thought at that point, hey, we need to look into this guy.
When interviewed, Lee said he owned a .308 caliber rifle that was stolen from his camp the night before Bruce was killed.
So that was really suspicious to us, is, the fact that all of a sudden, this man says, I had a .308 rifle stolen from my camp while I was up there, but I didn't know it was stolen until I got back to my apartment in Utah.
Lee reported that some of his Nosler brand .308 caliber ammunition was also stolen, the same brand as the shell casing found at the crime scene.
So a lot of things started pointing towards this guy, J.C. Lee.
J.C. Lee and Janice had divorced because Lee started dating a friend of their daughter's.
We thought that J.C. Lee may have been jealous of Janice recently marrying Bruce Dotson.
Maybe he wanted to get back at Janice?
We couldn't link J.C. Lee to the Dotson murder scene, and we couldn't link Janice Dotson to the ex-husband's camp 3/4 of a mile away.
Also suspicious, Janice had purchased 3 life insurance policies on Bruce shortly before his death.
She stood to gain almost $500,000, so it's a lot of motive.
And after the funeral, Janice's behavior was bizarre, to say the least.
One of his last requests was to be cremated and to have his ashes scattered in Leadville, Colorado. Janice had taken Bruce's ashes, and as they approached Leadville, she dumped them on the side of the road.
And Janice told investigators she was going to her cousin's home in East Texas to grieve. But investigators discovered she was doing no such thing.
We did a financial investigation on her, and we found that several times Janice Dotson's ATM card was used in Lake Charles, Louisiana, at a casino, Players Club. So we're thinking, well, how could she be in East Texas grieving, and her ATM card's being used in Louisiana at a gambling casino?
And even more bizarre, not long after Bruce was killed, Janice married husband number 3, Bart Hall.
Bart Hall, nice guy. He said, I felt so strong for Janice and for her welfare that after we got married, I took out a $100,000 life insurance policy on myself just to make sure if something happened to me, she was well taken care of. With that, Dave says, you don't hunt, do you?
Janice Dodson denied any involvement in her husband Bruce's murder. So did her ex-husband, J.C. Lee, who had an alibi. His girlfriend and a co-worker confirmed he was hunting with them at the time of the murder. Investigators searched the fields and forests near the crime scene for the .308 caliber rifle used in the murder, but found nothing.
We even cut down vegetation in the area, sagebrush, cleared a large area, and looked visually as well as with metal detectors.
They were hindered in their search because the area is covered in snow for almost half the year. For the next 3 summers, Bill Booth, his partner Dave Martinez, and others camped in the Uncompahgre National Park and looked for the .308 rifle. On one of their trips, Booth and Martinez took along a member of NecroSearch International, an organization of volunteers who use new technologies to find missing people, and in this case, missing weapons. They were searching for the rifle in a pond near J.C. Lee's campsite.
And it was at that time that we were at the pond near the ex-husband's camp when an individual from NecroSearch International identified the lining of this pond, stock pond, to be bentonite clay. And he said, boy, that's very unusual to have bentonite clay in the middle of the Uncompahgre National Forest in a stock pond.
And this jogged their memory. They remembered that Janice Dodson's clothes had been covered in mud on the day of her husband's murder. Janice's muddy clothing had been kept in evidence for the past 3 years. Jacqueline Battle scraped some of the mud from the clothing and ground it to a fine powder. Battle sifted and weighed the samples, and then examined them under a polarizing microscope. The mud from Janice's clothing contained bentonite.
Bentonite is a clay-like material comprised of minerals of aluminum silicates, magnesium, and iron oxides. Ranchers would add bentonite as a sealant so that the water would be retained in the watering hole versus seeping through into the ground.
The bentonite on Janice's clothing was identical to the sample from the pond behind her ex-husband's camp. Battles examined mud samples from other ponds in the national park, but none matched the mud from Janice's clothing.
So out of the samples that were submitted from the 3 ponds and the bog, bentonite might not be common, but in this case, it was unique in that it was in only one of the ponds that matched back up to the soil that was recovered from her boots.
We were ecstatic because we were now able to show that she was lying, and we were now able to show her in an area where the murder weapon was stolen.
To investigators, this was proof that Janice had stolen her ex-husband's gun, possibly in an attempt to frame him.
We were able to put Janice Dodson at her ex-husband's camp. We couldn't put the ex-husband at her camp.
Perhaps Janice killed 2 birds with 1 stone, J.C. Lee and John Bruce Dodson. We have no way of knowing what she had planned for J.C. Lee. Personally, I feel that J.C. Lee was going to be the fall guy, a patsy for Janice.
Investigators still had one question to answer. They knew a .308 caliber round went through Bruce's body, but a .243 caliber round was found in his lung. Where did this .243 caliber round come from?
This case is more twists and turns than a snake. And it was just one thing after another.
Lead bullets are made from recycled car batteries, which have numerous trace elements. A forensic metallurgist at the FBI analyzed the lead inner core of the bullet from Bruce Dodson's body using plasma atomic emission spectroscopy. It was compared to the .308 caliber round found at the scene.
So she tested for a certain number of, I think it's 6 or 8 trace elements, and when you compare them, there was a match.
Which meant both bullets were from the same batch.
The odds of a bullet from the same batch being in the victim and being in the hillside, of not being fired at the same sequence of shots. The odds against that were just astounding.
Prosecutors believe Janice Dodson planned her husband's murder almost from the day they got married. And she chose a campsite just a short distance away from where she knew her ex-husband had camped every year for the past 20 years. At some point, prosecutors say Janice quietly made her way over to her ex-husband's campsite, wading through the mud in the pond so she wouldn't be seen. While her ex-husband was away, she stole his Remington .308 caliber rifle and ammunition. But she never realized that the mud on her boots and coveralls could tie her to the robbery. The next day, Janice went hunting alone, and her husband was the prey. She hid in the bushes, waiting for Bruce to walk by, and then she fired. The first shot only grazed him. In a panic, Bruce took off his vest and waved to the shooter. The second shot entered his chest and came out under his right arm, and he fell to the ground. The third shot struck the fence post, shearing off the outer core before it hit and killed him. Janice inadvertently left one of the .308 shell casings behind. She got rid of the rifle somewhere in the Colorado wilderness before calling for help. Where she disposed of it remains a mystery.
If the suspect would have been a better shot and Mr. Dodson would have been killed with a single shot, it's possible that this would never have been investigated as a homicide.
We wouldn't have been looking for bullet fragments. We wouldn't have been looking for mud analysis.
Prosecutors believe the motive was greed.
I believe she married him with the intent to beef up his finances and kill him. That's about as cold-blooded as you can get.
So she would have got revenge. She would have got rid of Bruce Dodson, obtained approximately $500,000 in worth, and also put pin the rap on J.C. Lee to get even with him for leaving with their daughter's girlfriend. I think it was an excellent plan that didn't work.
5 years after the death of her husband, Janice Dodson went on trial for his murder.
We had forensic firearms evidence, forensic metallurgist. This case was built on forensics.
The jury deliberated for 3.5 days, then found Janice Dodson guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
When the verdict came in the courtroom, my legs turned to rubber. And all I can do today is, and I never got a chance, I wanted to thank the jury for all the work they did.
To investigators and the forensic experts who worked on the case, Janice Dodson was one step away from committing the perfect crime.
Janice probably never thought that where she walked and picked up soil on her boots and her clothing might have played a key part in convicting her.
Bruce was never far from our thoughts during this whole investigation, and I think he got some justice.
Wasn't for forensics, I can tell you right now, Janice Dodson would be walking the street. She assassinated Bruce Dodson. He didn't have a chance. I wouldn't even call her a Black Widow. I would call her just a greedy assassin.
For over a decade, suspicious fires burned businesses and homes in Southern California. Arson was suspected, but there was little physical evidence. Investigators found an important piece of evidence in a novel that describes several fires strikingly similar to the real ones. How was it possible that the author knew information never revealed to the Pasadena, California, a town of only 3 square miles located just north of Hollywood? On the night of October 10th, 1984, most residents were getting ready to watch the San Diego Padres take on the Detroit Tigers in the World Series. Jim Upton, just 19 years old at the time, was working as a cashier at Ole's Home Center.
And I was like, why is it so quiet in here? I go, oh yeah, it's the World Series this evening. I was like thanking God that it was nice and quiet in the store.
Around 7 p.m., Upton heard an emergency announcement over the public address system. He went to investigate.
I was walking toward the front of the store and I noticed a pillar of smoke, just a grayish white pillar of smoke.
Upton went to the hardware department and began to lead customers toward the front of the store.
I looked down one of the side aisles, even turned down the side aisle, and noticed at that point in time that there was just a wall of flames. I felt trapped and I didn't know where to go from there.
Then the lights went out, and Upton couldn't see the others. Everyone inside the store desperately tried to find a fire exit.
The first unit to arrive at Ole's observed a column of smoke coming from the roof area. The chief in charge was not certain at that time what they had. He didn't realize the extent of the conflagration.
Within a very short period of time, the fire was a roaring inferno. Jim Upton barely got out alive.
My ears were singed, the left arm was burnt. As soon as I got out of the store, I still remember touching my arm and the skin just falling off of it.
4 others were not so fortunate.
He was trapped in there. He was dead. That's all we know.
Your son, your grandson,
My grandbaby. He would have been 3 in January.
Matthew Troidel was the youngest victim. His grandmother, Ada Deal, and 2 store employees, Jimmy Satina and Carolyn Krause, also perished. When the fire was extinguished, investigators searched through the rubble for clues.
Just in normal fire investigation, you have to first discover the area and point of origin. You can't find out what caused the fire unless you can find out where the fire started.
But investigators couldn't determine the origin.
When one goes to the scene of an arson fire, one finds essentially a pile of trash, 3 feet of water sometimes, and it's extremely hard to find the point of origin.
The official explanation was that the fire was accidental. But John Orr, arson investigator for the nearby Glendale Fire Department, strongly disagreed. He was at the fire and took these photos.
Within a day of the fire, John Orr met with Karen Berry, who was the sister-in-law of one of the victims of the fire, and he expressed his opinion that this, in fact, was an arson fire.
Orr believed the fire started in some patio cushions, which were made of polyurethane foam, a highly flammable petroleum byproduct. The debate didn't last long. Soon, there would be other fires. There was no doubt an arsonist was on the loose. Two months after the fire at Ole's Home Center, there was another suspicious fire at a second Ole store. This time, there was no dispute. The cause was arson.
The fire was set in the foam padding section of the home products department.
And 90 miles away, there were several other suspicious fires in Bakersfield, California. One of the fires occurred at a Kraft Mart store. Arson investigator Marvin Casey arrived at the scene shortly after it was extinguished.
Kraft Mart is where they sell different crafts. They sell foam rubber batting and dry vegetation for making floral arrangements.
And at this fire, investigators found their first real piece of evidence in a bin of dried flowers.
I looked in the bin and I saw a yellow-lined piece of paper that was used to conceal an incendiary device. It was readily recognizable because it had 3 matches that were wrapped around a cigarette butt, and it was attached with a rubber band.
The incendiary device burned slowly, allowing the arsonist time to make a getaway.
The burning cigarette will come down and it will ignite the sulfur on the end of the match head, you instantly have a going flame.
And there was another fire that same day in a nearby fabric store. That started in a bin holding pillows and foam rubber.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that you have a problem with a firebug on the loose.
There were other suspicious fires in Fresno and Tulare, cities north of Bakersfield. At one, investigators found an incendiary device identical to the one found at the Kraft Mart fire. When Casey reviewed the dates and times of these fires, he discovered a troubling coincidence. They all occurred along Highway 99 around the time a group of arson investigators met for their annual convention in Fresno.
So that just threw up a red flag in my mind, thinking that it could possibly be one of our own setting fires.
Casey got the list of the 300 people who attended the conference and narrowed it down to 55 people based on where they lived in relation to the convention center.
What these 55 people had in common was that they had attended the conference, they had traveled alone, they had passed through Bakersfield down 99.
When Casey told his superiors that one of these 55 arson professionals was their serial arsonist, he was ignored.
I was an outcast. I was shunned for developing this theory of fire investigators setting fires.
Nobody that I know of believed that Casey was on to anything.
As a matter of fact, when I would attend the conventions, I couldn't talk to anybody about this theory very much because nobody would really want to listen and nobody shared my idea with it.
But maybe they should have. The incendiary device from the Kraft Mart fire was sent to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms for analysis. It was a yellow piece of lined paper folded neatly with a cigarette and some matches inside. ATF's fingerprint experts selected ninhydrin to look for possible prints.
Ninhydrin is a wet chemical that, when applied to the paper, actually reacts to the amino acids, which are part of what makes up a fingerprint residue.
It usually takes a day for the chemical to dry, but heating the circulating air speeds up the process. Miraculously, they found a partial print.
Fingerprints are referred to as just a chance impression. They may be there and they may not. So to find a fingerprint, especially to find one that was identifiable, the examiners as well as the investigators were very lucky in this case.
The color of the paper and the lines obscured the print. To bring out additional detail, criminalists photographed it with a special filter.
The filters would then enhance not only the print, but the ridge detail that makes up the pattern. And then also with the filters, it would eliminate any of the background color so that the pattern can be seen more clearly.
The print was entered into AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system containing prints of convicted criminals. Unfortunately, the print did not match any in the database of known criminal offenders. Marvin Casey then asked the ATF to compare the print to the 55 individuals on his list of people who attended the arson convention near the fires, but that request was denied.
They felt like that was too many names to submit to the different departments to get their fingerprint cards to analyze.
Casey's investigation had come to a dead end. Then, 2 years later, there was another rash of store fires, this time in cities along Highway 101. When Casey examined the dates of the fires, he discovered that they also coincided with a nearby convention of arson investigators. And on that list of attendees were 10 individuals who had also attended the earlier arson conference.
I was quite excited. Now I felt like we have something we can work with.
He persuaded ATF to take these 10 names to their lab surreptitiously obtain fingerprint impressions and compare them to the print that he'd found, and could not come back with a positive finding.
But they could find no match. Casey couldn't believe it.
And I was kind of discouraged too, because I just felt like that we're going to get somewhere with these 10 names off of this list.
Another 2 years passed. Then the arsonist struck again in Los Angeles, setting fires in dozens of stores throughout the area and causing millions of dollars in damages. ATF Special Agent Mike Matassa headed the investigation.
The MO was to start fires in retail businesses, midday hours primarily during open business.
Matassa heard about Marvin Casey's controversial theory that these fires were started by an arson investigator. And he also learned about the fingerprint on the incendiary device. So Matassa asked the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office to analyze the print. They compared it to their fingerprint database of everyone who had ever applied there for a job. And they found a match.
I was blown away. Couldn't believe it.
The print matched the left ring finger of John Leonard Orr, an arson investigator with the Glendale, California Fire Department.
John Orr wanted to be a Los Angeles police officer for a long time. He applied in 1981. He passed all of the tests except one. It was the psychological test.
Orr then applied for a job with the Los Angeles Fire Department, but failed the physical part of the training.
He wasn't in good enough shape, and that was a crushing disappointment in his life.
Eventually, he worked odd jobs until finally getting a job with the Glendale Fire Department.
It was the lowest paying fire department in the Los Angeles area, and he quickly rose through the ranks and became an arson investigator and eventually a captain.
Orr was one of the 10 people on Casey's list who had attended both arson conventions. The earlier fingerprint comparison had simply missed it. The print linked Orr to only one of the fires.
Rather than arrest him on one fire with minimal damage, probably would have a very minimal sentence associated with it, we decided to investigate and try to tie him into all of the fires that had the same MO.
And for that, they turned to the latest in surveillance technology. After a 7-year search for the serial arsonist, California investigators finally had a suspect. But the evidence against John Orr, a partial fingerprint, linked him to only one of the fires. So investigators decided to track Orr's whereabouts by planting a device on his car called a teletrack.
The tracking device itself is about the size of a videotape. It can be installed anywhere in the car.
The teletrack system uses a network of communication towers which transmits signals to the wireless device mounted in the car. In some ways, it's better than ground satellite systems.
The one disadvantage of GPS is that if you're in a garage or if the antenna is blocked from seeing the sky, it's very hard to get a good location. With this technology, we don't need to see the sky.
On November 22, 1991, at 3:30 p.m., the teletrack placed Orr near the Warner Brothers studio in Burbank, where a fire broke out on the set of a television show. Interestingly, Orr immediately drove home, then received the official dispatch from headquarters. The dispatcher inadvertently gave the wrong address for the fire.
We can watch him on the teletrack device, leave his house, drive to the first fire location, which was misidentified in the dispatch, but yet he makes it to the right location. And with that information, we couldn't tie him directly to the cause of that fire, but we knew that we couldn't allow him to be on the street any longer.
With a warrant, investigators searched Orr's home.
We found in his briefcase cigarettes, matches, rubber bands, the type of materials that were used in the device, and we found yellow line paper in his car.
Orr denied that there was anything sinister about the materials, and also denied it was his fingerprint on the incendiary device found at one of the fires.
I've never set an arson fire except in my training exercises.
And investigators found evidence that Orr planned some of the fires long before they happened. On a home video found among Orr's things was a close-up of a beautiful hillside home in California. There's footage of the same house 18 months later on fire.
He had what would we call before and after shots of the fire, and shots actually as the fire was being perpetrated before any fire companies could arrive.
Other people said that he photographed the fires so that he could relive the event, for the same reason that serial killers photograph victims, so that they can look at them later and relive the events.
Also confiscated from Orr's home was a manuscript for a book he had written. It was about a fictitious firefighter turned arsonist, Aaron Stiles. The similarities between the book and the real crimes were far too coincidental. The Stiles character used delayed devices to set fires in retail stores while on his way to and from arson conferences.
He discussed how he set multiple fires at the same time in order to distract firefighting personnel to one location to the other so he could sit and watch one of the other fires become rather large.
And the book describes a fire at a Cal's hardware store similar to the fire in South Pasadena that killed 4 people. In the novel, one of the dead victims was a young boy named Matthew, the same name of the 2-year-old who died in the real fire.
The deaths were blotted out of his mind. It wasn't his fault, just stupid people acting as stupid people do.
Joseph Wambaugh wrote a book about this case called Fire Lover.
I think John Orr does a better job than anyone in describing the psyche of the organized serial arsonist. The power, the excitement, the thrill that motivates these people. In his novel, Points of Origin, he has his arson investigator explain it like this. The fire becomes a mistress, a lover. From those words of John Orr, I got my title, Fire Lover. As I thought about it, my mistress, my lover, the fire.
John Orr was charged with numerous counts of arson and for the murder of the 4 victims of the Oldies fire.
We, the jury, in the above entitled case, find the defendant, John Leonard Orr, guilty of the crime of first-degree murder in violation of Penal Code Setting.
He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
For the 10 years prior to John's arrest, there were an average of 67 brush fires per year in the hills above Glendale, Burbank, Pasadena, major fires. And after John's arrest, the average number of fires in that same area dropped from 67 to 1.
Well, it's my opinion that he set in excess of 2,000 fires over a period of about 30 years.
John Orr is believed to be one of the 20th century's most prolific arsonists. His long career brought to an end by a scrap of charred paper and the relentless work of investigators.
The first thing investigators noticed was the silence. Not the silence of an empty house, not the silence of a town asleep after midnight. This was different. It was the kind of silence that arrives after something terrible has already happened, when every ordinary sound suddenly feels wrong. At 6:17 on a warm September morning in 1989, A pickup truck rolled slowly along an isolated stretch of road outside a small East Texas community. The driver was on his way to work. He had traveled the same road hundreds of times. He knew every curve, every fence line, every abandoned oil pump. Then he saw the car. It was parked several yards off the road beneath a line of cedar trees. The driver's door was open. The engine was still running, and there was no one inside. He stopped. At first, he assumed the driver had simply stepped away. Maybe a mechanical problem, maybe a flat tire. But when he walked closer, he saw a woman's purse lying on the passenger seat. A single shoe rested near the open door. The driver's seat was pushed backward. The radio was still playing. And on the floorboard was a small silver key chain shaped like a star. The man backed away and called police. By the time deputies arrived, the morning sun had begun burning through the mist. The vehicle belonged to 26-year-old Laura Bennett. She was gone. There was no note, no obvious struggle, no witnesses who had seen her leave, no explanation for why her car had been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. For the people who lived nearby, it was frightening. For investigators, it was the beginning of a case that would eventually become one of the county's most haunting cold cases. Laura had disappeared sometime during the early morning hour. The night before, she had finished work at a small medical supply company in town. Coworkers remembered nothing unusual. She had laughed with another employee near the front entrance. She had talked about dinner plans. She had mentioned that she wanted to stop somewhere before going home. Then she left. That was the last confirmed sighting. Her apartment was only 15 minutes away. She never made it. The first hours of the investigation moved quickly. Deputies searched the roadside. Officers checked nearby properties. Tracking dogs were brought in. Friends were questioned. Family members were contacted. Hospitals were called. Jails were checked. Every possibility was considered. Laura had not simply vanished. Something had interrupted her journey home. The question was what? By noon, search teams had expanded into the surrounding woods. They found tire tracks near the shoulder. They found a cigarette, but beneath a tree. They found a torn piece of blue fabric caught on a fence. But nothing immediately connected those objects to Laura. Then, just before sunset, a volunteer searcher found something disturbing. A narrow dirt trail disappeared into the trees less than half a mile from where Laura's car had been abandoned. The trail showed signs of recent vehicle traffic. Investigators followed it. At the end was an old hunting structure. Empty. Dusty. Unused, according to the property owner. But inside, detectives found a disposable lighter, several cigarette filters, and a strip of blue fabric. The fabric appeared similar to the material found near Laura's car. It was enough to raise suspicion. It was not enough to prove anything. The property owner was questioned. He denied knowing Laura. He denied seeing her that night. He said the hunting structure had not been used in weeks. His statement was recorded. His fingerprints were taken. He was released. At the time, investigators had no physical evidence strong enough to hold him. The case began to fracture into possibilities. Maybe Laura had been abducted by a stranger. Maybe she had accepted a ride. Maybe someone she knew had intercepted her. Maybe the abandoned vehicle was deliberately staged. Every theory created another question. Why leave the engine running? Why take Laura but leave her purse? Why leave the keys? Why leave the radio playing? And why had nobody heard anything? The investigation intensified for several weeks. Then came the first major break. A waitress at a roadside diner told detectives that she had seen Laura shortly before midnight. Laura had been sitting alone. A man had approached her table. The waitress remembered him because he had been wearing a dark work jacket despite the warm weather. She remembered something else. Laura had appeared uncomfortable. Not frightened. Not yet. Just uncomfortable. The man sat across from her. They spoke for several minutes. Then Laura stood. She paid her bill. The two walked outside together. The waitress watched through the window. She saw Laura get into her own car. The man walked away. At the time, investigators believed the man might have been the key to everything. But there was a problem. The waitress could not identify him. She could only describe him as white, approximately 30 years old, medium build, dark hair. That description fit hundreds of men in the area. Detectives interviewed people who knew Laura. Several admitted she had been seeing someone casually. A former boyfriend was questioned. He had an alibi. Another acquaintance was investigated. Nothing connected him to the disappearance. Then investigators discovered something that changed the direction of the case. Laura had withdrawn cash earlier that afternoon, a significant amount. She had also purchased a small overnight bag. That suggested she might have been planning to leave town, but her family insisted she had no reason to disappear. She had a job, an apartment, plans for the weekend. She had promised her younger sister she would attend a family gathering. She had not packed clothing. She had not canceled work. She had not taken her passport. She had left almost everything behind. Whatever happened that night, Laura had not planned to vanish. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then 8. The search produced nothing. Winter came. The case began losing momentum. And then, on a cold January morning, investigators found another piece of evidence. A maintenance worker clearing brush near an abandoned drainage canal discovered a woman's bracelet. It was badly damaged. The clasp was broken. Laura's mother identified it immediately. It belonged to Laura. The discovery changed the investigation from a missing person case into a suspected homicide. Search teams returned to the area. For 3 days, they combed the surrounding land. They found nothing else. No body, no clothing, no weapon, no clear trail. The bracelet became one more unanswered question. How had it reached the canal? Who had broken the clasp? And how long had it been there? Years passed. Laura's photograph remained on the family's wall. Her mother refused to remove it. Her sister kept Laura's final birthday card in a drawer. Friends married. Children were born. Businesses closed. The old hunting structure was eventually demolished. The road was widened. The diner disappeared. The town changed. But Laura Bennett remained frozen in 1989. For investigators, the file became another cold case. The evidence was stored. The interviews were archived. The photographs were placed in boxes. The names of suspects remained in handwritten notes. Nothing moved. Then technology changed everything. In 2024, a new detective assigned to the county's unsolved cases reopened Laura's file. At first, there was no reason to believe the case could be solved. 35 years had passed. Several witnesses were dead. Others had moved away. Physical evidence had deteriorated. Some original records were incomplete, but the detective noticed something buried in an evidence inventory. The cigarette, but found near Laura's abandoned vehicle, had never been subjected to modern DNA testing. The technology available in 1989 had been primitive compared with what investigators could use decades later. The evidence was sent to a laboratory. Weeks passed. Then the call came. A usable DNA profile had been developed. It did not match Laura. It belonged to an unknown male. Investigators searched available databases. Nothing. The profile was uploaded again. Still nothing. For a moment, it looked like another dead end. Then genealogical research produced a distant family connection. Investigators followed the trail. One name kept appearing. A man who had lived in the county in 1989. A man who had been questioned during the original investigation. A man whose name had disappeared from public attention for decades. His name was Daniel Mercer. In 1989, Mercer was 32. He worked irregular construction job. He lived less than 10 miles from the road where Laura's car was found. He owned a dark pickup truck, and according to the original case notes, he had been seen at the roadside diner that night. But Mercer had never been charged. He had denied knowing Laura. He had denied speaking to her. He had denied being anywhere near the hunting property. For 37 years, those denials had remained in the file. Now investigators had something different, a DNA profile. They began watching him. They waited. Then came the moment investigators had been hoping for. Mercer discarded a drinking cup outside a grocery store. Detectives recovered it. The laboratory compared the DNA. The result was devastating. The profile was consistent with the DNA recovered from the cigarette, but in 1989, 37 years after Laura Bennett disappeared, investigators finally had a direct connection. Mercer was arrested. The news spread through the community within hours. A case many people believed would never be solved had suddenly returned to the headline. But the arrest did not answer everything. It created new questions. Where was Laura? What happened after she left the diner? Why had Mercer denied knowing her? And most importantly, why had investigators been unable to see the connection in 1989? The arrest brought no immediate closure. Mercer refused to explain what happened. He refused to reveal where Laura had gone. And without that final answer, the case remained suspended between justice and mystery. For Laura's family, the arrest was both devastating and extraordinary. They had spent decades living with the possibility that the truth might never come. Now there was a suspect, a name, a face, a person who had carried the secret for 37 years. But somewhere beyond the courtroom, beyond the police file, beyond the yellowed photographs and fading reports, one question still remained. What happened to Laura Bennett after she stepped into the darkness that night? And why had the truth waited 37 years to finally speak? The arrest of Daniel Mercer did not end the mystery. It made the mystery darker. For 37 years, investigators had searched for a person who could explain what happened to Laura Bennett. Now they had one, a man whose DNA had allegedly been recovered from evidence preserved since 1989. A man who had once lived within miles of the abandoned car. A man who had appeared in the original investigation and walked away without charges. But when detectives placed him in an interrogation room, Mercer did not look like a man who had just been caught. He looked like a man who had been waiting. The room was small. Gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted high in the corner. Mercer sat with his hands folded in front of him. The detective placed a photograph on the table. Laura, 26 years old, smiling, alive. Mercer stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then he looked away. "You knew her," the detective said. Mercer said nothing. "You were at the diner." "Nothing." "You spoke to her." Still nothing. The detective slid another photograph across the table. Laura's abandoned car. The open driver's door. The dark road. The evidence marker beside the shoe. Mercer finally spoke. "I don't remember." It was the same answer he had given decades earlier. But this time, investigators had something the original detectives never had. DNA. They told him about the cigarette butt. They told him the profile had been preserved for decades. They told him modern testing had connected the biological evidence to him. Mercer leaned back. For the first time, his expression changed. Not panic. Not surprise. Something colder. Recognition. He understood that the past had finally caught up, but he still refused to tell them where Laura was. That became the central problem. A DNA match could place Mercer near Laura. It could connect him to an object found near the abandoned vehicle. It could challenge his old statement. But it could not tell investigators exactly what happened. It could not produce Laura. And after 37 years, the absence of a body remained the most painful piece of the entire case. Investigators went back to the beginning. They reconstructed Laura's final day minute by minute. At 7:12 that morning, Laura left her apartment. At work, coworkers remembered her being in a good mood. She finished her shift. She made a phone call. She stopped at a convenience store. Then she disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of an East Texas evening. Nothing about the day suggested she knew she was approaching the final hours of her life. That was what haunted her family most. There had been no warning, no goodbye, no final message, no final photograph. Only a series of ordinary moments that nobody recognized as important until it was too late. Investigators revisited the diner. The building was gone. The parking lot had been replaced by a storage facility. The waitress who had originally spoken to police had died years earlier, but her old statement remained. It described a man sitting across from Laura, a dark jacket, a tense conversation, a walk into the parking lot, and something investigators had overlooked. The waitress had remembered seeing the man carry something under his arm. At the time, she assumed it was a rolled-up jacket. 37 years later, detectives wondered if it had been something else. A blanket, a bag, a piece of equipment, something capable of changing the entire interpretation of that night. Investigators searched the original interview notes. The detail was there, buried in a paragraph. One sentence, almost forgotten. It had never been followed up. That sentence sent detectives back to Mercer. They searched his employment records. In 1989, he had worked temporary construction job. One company had hired him for road maintenance. His work sometimes took him into isolated areas outside town. One of those locations was less than 2 miles from the drainage canal where Laura's bracelet was eventually found. The coincidence was difficult to ignore. But coincidences do not put people in prison. Evidence does. So investigators kept digging. They examined the old property record. The hunting structure had belonged to a local landowner who had died years earlier. The property had changed hands twice. The original structure was gone. But county maps showed something hidden beneath decades of development. An old service road. It connected the hunting property to a network of drainage paths and wooded areas. In 1989, the road was barely used. Today, much of it had disappeared beneath new construction. Detectives walked the area. They found concrete remnants, rusting fence posts, pieces of old machinery. Then one investigator noticed a shallow depression in the ground. It was near the old drainage canal. The area had been disturbed many times over the years. There was no guarantee anything remained. Still, the team brought in ground-penetrating equipment. The results were inconclusive. They scanned again. Nothing. They expanded the search. Still nothing. The case seemed to be slipping backward. Then Mercer made a mistake. During another interview, detectives asked him about the hunting structure. He said he had never been inside. That statement immediately raised suspicion, because the original property owner had told police in 1989 that Mercer had been there before, not on the night Laura disappeared, but earlier. Mercer had supposedly helped repair part of the structure. He had access. He knew the property. He knew the roads. And he knew how isolated the area was. When detectives confronted him with that information, he changed his answer. He said he might have visited once, then twice. Then he admitted he had spent several nights there. The story was changing, piece by piece, and every change made the old investigation look different. The detectives returned to the evidence room. They examined everything again. The blue fabric, the cigarette filters, the bracelet, Laura's personal belongings, the photographs, the old fingerprints, the original vehicle inspection. Some evidence had deteriorated. Some could no longer be tested. But one item remained remarkably preserved. A fragment of fabric recovered from the fence near Laura's vehicle. Modern testing revealed traces of biological material. The sample was tiny, too degraded for a complete profile, but there was enough for investigators to compare it against known evidence. The result did not prove Mercer had touched the fabric, but it strengthened the connection. And then came another discovery. Laura's vehicle had been processed in 1989. Investigators had found a faint smear on the interior door handle. It had never been analyzed for DNA. At the time, technicians simply documented it. Decades later, the sample was still in storage. The laboratory tested it. The profile was incomplete. The portions were consistent with the same male profile recovered from the cigarette. The case was no longer resting on one piece of evidence. There were multiple links. The abandoned car, the cigarette, the diner, the hunting property, the drainage area, and Mercer himself. Yet Laura was still missing. Her family had waited nearly 4 decades for that one piece of information. Where was she? Mercer knew. Investigators became convinced of it. They offered him opportunities to speak. He refused. They showed him photographs of the search area. He remained silent. They asked him whether Laura was still alive when he last saw her. He stared at the table. Then he said something that changed the room. I never meant for any of this to happen. The detective leaned forward. What does that mean? Mercer said nothing. Did you hurt Laura? Silence. Did you kill her? Mercer closed his eyes. He never answered. The statement was not a confession. It was not enough to reveal the entire truth. But for investigators, it was the closest thing to an admission they had heard in 37 years. The search intensified. Teams returned to the old property. This time, they brought cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains even after decades. The dogs moved through the trees, past the old foundation, across the drainage canal, toward a section of land that had once been almost impossible to reach. One dog stopped. It began circling. Then it scratched at the earth. Investigators froze. The area was secured. The soil was carefully removed, layer by layer. Nothing. The dog was brought back. It alerted again. This time, investigators expanded the excavation. They found old animal bones, rotten wood, a rusted metal container, but no human remains. The alert could not be explained. Another disappointment. Another night without answers. For Laura's sister, the developments were unbearable. For decades, she had lived with 2 possibilities. Laura was dead, or Laura was somewhere alive. The arrest destroyed the second possibility, but it did not provide the first one's final proof. There was still no grave, no final resting place, no place where her family could stand and say, This is where she is. Only an arrest. Only a suspect. Only evidence pointing backward through time. Meanwhile, news of the arrest spread across Texas. People who remembered the disappearance began talking again. Old newspaper clippings resurfaced. Photographs appeared online. Former neighbors contacted investigators. One man claimed he remembered seeing Mercer near the abandoned vehicle that morning. Another remembered a dark pickup parked near the drainage road. A former coworker remembered Mercer asking unusual questions about Laura weeks before her disappearance. Most of these memories were decades old. Some conflicted. Some could not be verified. But one witness provided something investigators had never heard before. He said that on the morning Laura disappeared, he had seen Mercer washing the bed of his pickup. It was unusually early, around 5:30. The witness remembered because Mercer had been standing outside in the darkness with a garden hose. When asked why, Mercer allegedly said he had spilled paint. The witness never thought about it again until 37 years later. Investigators checked Mercer's old truck record. The vehicle had been sold months after Laura disappeared. Its current location was unknown. The truck itself was long gone. But the memory remained. And suddenly, the case seemed to contain one more hidden layer. Mercer had not simply been near Laura. He may have been preparing to erase something. Something investigators in 1989 never knew to look for. Something that had disappeared along with Laura. The truth was now close enough to feel, but still out of reach. And, as detectives prepared the case for court, one question became impossible to escape. If Mercer knew where Laura had gone, why had he remained silent for 37 years? Fear? Guilt? A secret involving someone else? Or something far more disturbing? Because the arrest had solved one mystery. It had identified the man investigators believed was responsible, but it had not solved the disappearance. Laura Bennett was still missing. And somewhere beneath the layers of Texas soil, old memories, forgotten evidence, and 37 years of silence, the final answer was still waiting. The morning after Daniel Mercer was arrested, the courthouse steps became the center of attention. News crews arrived before sunrise. Satellite trucks lined the street. Cameras waited behind barricades. For the first time in 37 years, the name Laura Bennett was being spoken across the county again. But inside the courthouse, there was no celebration. Laura was still missing. Her family still had no grave to visit. And the man sitting in a holding cell had not confessed. Mercer's first court appearance lasted only minutes. The judge confirmed the charges. The prosecutor described the evidence as substantial. The defense argued that the case was built around evidence from another century. 37 years had passed. Memories faded. Witnesses died. Records disappeared. And the central question remained unanswered. Where was Laura? Mercer stood quietly. He did not look toward Laura's family. He did not speak to reporters. He did not react when the prosecutor mentioned the abandoned vehicle. But when the judge ordered him held without bond, Mercer finally looked up. For a brief moment, his eyes met those of Laura's sister. Neither moved. Then the deputies took him away. Outside, reporters surrounded the family. They asked what the arrest meant. Laura's sister said only one sentence. We have waited long enough. Then she walked away. That sentence spread quickly. But behind the headlines, investigators were still working, because an arrest was not the same as a solved case. They needed to know exactly what happened on that September night, and they believed Mercer knew. The first major task was reconstructing his movements. Investigators went back to 1989. They searched employment records, old pay stubs, gas station receipts, telephone logs, property documents, anything that could place Mercer between the hours of Laura's disappearance. The records were incomplete. Some businesses had closed. Some documents had been destroyed. But one record survived. A fuel purchase. 2:43 a.m. The location was a small gas station several miles from Laura's abandoned car. The receipt showed cash. No name. But the original clerk had written a note on the back. Dark pickup. Man alone. The clerk was no longer alive. The note had been overlooked for decades. Investigators compared the description with Mercer's old vehicle. It matched. The discovery did not prove Mercer had been with Laura, but it placed him on the road during the critical window. Then investigators found something even more disturbing. The gas station was located only minutes from the drainage canal, the same canal where Laura's bracelet had been found months after her disappearance. The timeline began forming. Laura leaves the diner. Mercer is nearby. Her car is abandoned. A dark pickup appears on the road. A bracelet is later found near the canal. Mercer's DNA appears on evidence connected to the vehicle, and Mercer eventually admits he had been inside the hunting structure. Still, the most important piece was missing: Laura herself. Search teams expanded the investigation beyond the locations already examined. They studied historical aerial photographs. Modern maps could be misleading. Land changes. Trees disappear. Roads are moved. Rivers shift. Construction covers old paths. Investigators wanted to see the landscape as it existed in 1989. The photographs revealed something nobody had noticed. Behind the hunting property was a narrow strip of undeveloped land. It stretched for almost a mile. In 1989, it connected directly to the drainage system. Today, part of it was hidden beneath a warehouse complex, but the old photographs showed a dirt access road running deep into the wood. Investigators traced it. The road led to a small clearing. The clearing was not visible from the main highway. It was almost completely hidden. And there was another detail: a shallow pond. In 1989, the pond was surrounded by thick vegetation. Today, it had almost disappeared. Investigators wondered whether Laura could have been taken there. A search was organized. Cadaver dogs were brought in again. The ground was scanned. Soil samples were collected. Every suspicious depression was examined. Nothing. The frustration was becoming unbearable. Investigators had a suspect. They had evidence. They had a timeline. But they still had no body. Then Mercer asked to speak with his attorney. A few hours later, he made an unexpected request. He wanted to talk to investigators. The detectives returned to the interrogation room. Mercer sat down. He looked older now. His hands trembled slightly. For nearly 4 decades, he had lived under the assumption that the case would never return. Now the past was sitting across from him. The detective placed Laura's photograph on the table. Mercer stared at it. "I knew her," he said. It was the first time he had admitted it. The detective remained silent. Mercer continued. "She wasn't supposed to be there." The room became completely still. "Where?" the detective asked. Mercer looked down. "At the property." That answer changed everything. Mercer admitted Laura had gone with him willingly, at least initially. He claimed they had argued. He said Laura wanted to leave. He said he tried to stop her. Then he stopped talking. The detective asked what happened next. Mercer refused to answer. "Did she leave the property alive?" No answer. "Did you kill her?" Mercer looked toward the wall. "I don't want to talk about that." The interview ended. But the admission was enough to reshape the case. Mercer had finally placed himself and Laura together. That was something investigators had never been able to establish in 1989. They returned to the old property. This time, they searched with a new question. Not where could Laura have disappeared, but where would someone hide something they never wanted found? The investigators studied the terrain: steep ground, drainage channels, thick vegetation, old wells, collapsed structures, buried debris. One area stood out: a concrete culvert beneath the old service road. It had been there in 1989. Today, it was almost completely buried. Investigators opened it. Inside, they found trash. Old bottles, rust, broken tools, nothing connected to Laura. But one investigator noticed a section of concrete that appeared newer than the surrounding structure. The repair was dated indirectly through the materials. It appeared to have been done sometime around 1990. That was significant. Who had repaired it? County records showed no official work order. The landowner had reported no repair. Investigators interviewed a former contractor who remembered the culvert. He said Mercer had helped with maintenance in the area. Again, Mercer was connected. Again, there was no direct proof, but the pattern was becoming difficult to dismiss. Then the laboratory delivered another result. A small biological sample recovered from the interior of Laura's vehicle contained DNA from 2 individuals, Laura, and the same unidentified male profile. The profile was consistent with Mercer. The result did not establish exactly when the biological material was deposited. It did not prove murder, but it destroyed Mercer's original claim that he had never been inside Laura's car. The defense would later argue that the evidence could have been transferred through innocent contact. Investigators disagreed. They believed the combination of evidence was overwhelming. But there was another problem. The cigarette, Mercer insisted he had smoked cigarettes around the county. That was true. His defense argued that finding his DNA near Laura's vehicle did not establish murder. The prosecutor knew this. They needed more. They needed the story. They needed to know why Laura had been taken. They needed to know where she went. And they needed to know whether someone else had been involved. So investigators examined Mercer's personal life in 1989. They discovered he had been under financial pressure. He owed money. He had recently lost steady employment. He had been arguing with people over unpaid debt. Laura, investigators learned, had recently threatened to report someone at her workplace for stealing medical supplies. That possibility opened another direction. Was Mercer involved in something larger? Had Laura discovered something? Had she accidentally become a witness? Investigators checked the medical supply company. The original business records were mostly gone, but an old accountant was still alive. She remembered Laura. She remembered the missing supplies. And she remembered that Laura had been worried during the weeks before her disappearance. She had told a co-worker that someone was following her. The statement had never appeared in the original police report. Why? The co-worker had moved away shortly after Laura disappeared. Investigators tracked her down. She remembered the conversation. Laura had allegedly told her that a man had been waiting near her apartment. She did not know his name. She only remembered the truck. A dark pickup. The same type of vehicle Mercer drove. For the first time, investigators wondered whether Laura's disappearance had been planned. Maybe the diner encounter was not random. Maybe Mercer had been watching her. Maybe he had approached her because he already knew where she would be. That possibility changed the emotional weight of the case. Laura had not simply encountered a stranger. She may have been targeted. The investigation began focusing on the days before her disappearance. Who had contacted Laura? Who had followed her? Who knew her schedule? Who knew she would stop at the diner? Who knew which road she would take home? And then investigators found a telephone record. One call, made from a payphone near Laura's workplace. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. It was placed to Laura's apartment. The caller did not leave a message. The call occurred hours before Laura's disappearance. The original detectives had never identified the call. The phone booth no longer existed, but the timing mattered. Someone had been trying to reach Laura, and investigators now suspected Mercer. When confronted, Mercer denied making the call, but his denial was weaker than before because the detective already knew something he did not. The payphone was located near the construction site where Mercer had been working. The old case was beginning to look less like a random disappearance. It looked like a sequence. A phone call, a diner meeting, a dark pickup, an abandoned car, a remote property, a bracelet near the canal, and decades of silence. Still, one question remained above all others. What happened after Laura entered the hunting property? Mercer had finally admitted she was there, but he still refused to say how she left. The investigators knew they were close, and somewhere in the old records was a detail that could change the entire case. A detail written down in 1989. A detail nobody had understood. A detail connected to the final hours of Laura Bennett. The detail was hidden inside a 3-page supplemental report written by a deputy who had left the department less than a year after Laura disappeared. It was almost impossible to notice. No headline, no warning, no bold notation, just one sentence near the bottom of the second page. A witness had reported seeing a woman standing beside a dark pickup on an unpaved road shortly after 2 in the morning. The witness had not known who she was. The deputy had written the information down. Then the case moved on. 37 years later, investigators realized that sentence might have been the missing link. The witness was still alive. His name was Raymond Cole. He was 78 years old when detectives found him. He lived several counties away and had almost forgotten the incident. At first, he remembered nothing. Then detectives showed him an old photograph of Laura. He stared at it, long enough that nobody in the room spoke. Finally, he nodded. I think that was her. The investigators leaned forward. Raymond explained that in 1989 he had been driving home from a late shift at a paper mill. He had taken the back road because it was faster. It was after 2 in the morning. There was almost no traffic. Then his headlights caught a pickup parked near the tree. A woman was standing beside it. She appeared to be arguing with someone. Raymond slowed down. The woman looked toward his headlights. He remembered one thing clearly. She raised one hand. Not a wave. More like a gesture asking him to stop. But Raymond kept driving. He was afraid. The road was isolated. He did not know the people. He told detectives he looked in his rearview mirror. The woman was still standing there. Then the pickup moved. It followed him for several seconds. Raymond accelerated. The truck eventually turned off. He never reported it immediately. That was the part that haunted him. "I should have stopped," he said. Detectives asked him to describe the driver. Raymond closed his eyes. He remembered a man wearing a dark jacket, medium build, dark hair. He could not remember the face. But then detectives asked about the truck. Raymond opened his eyes. It had something on the side. What? He thought. A white stripe. That detail matched an old photograph of Mercer's pickup. Investigators had finally found something that connected a witness to the vehicle. But there was another detail. Raymond remembered the woman carrying a small bag. Laura's overnight bag had never been recovered, the one she purchased earlier that day. The bag investigators had once believed suggested she might have planned to leave town. Now they wondered if she had been carrying it when she encountered Mercer. Maybe she had been trying to leave. Maybe she had been asking for help. Maybe the entire meaning of that purchase had been misunderstood. The investigators returned to the original timeline. Laura bought the bag. Laura went to the diner. She met Mercer. She drove away. Then, somewhere along the back road, she encountered him again. The question was why? Did he follow her? Did she agree to meet him? Or had he intercepted her? The detectives needed answers. They questioned Mercer again. This time, they showed him Raymond's statement. Mercer stared at the page. He did not deny owning the truck. He did not deny being in the area. But he said Raymond was mistaken. The detective asked why. Mercer shrugged. 37 years is a long time. The detective pushed the photograph across the table. The old pickup. Mercer looked at it. Then he said something unexpected. "That wasn't my only truck." The room went quiet. Mercer claimed he had borrowed another vehicle that night. He refused to identify the owner. Investigators checked the record. The truck had belonged to a man named Carl Danner. Danner had died in 2007. He had been a friend of Mercer. More importantly, Danner's property was located near the hunting structure. Investigators searched his old records. They found an insurance document, a dark pickup, white side stripe, registered to Danner. The description matched Raymond's memory, but there was a problem. The vehicle had been sold 2 weeks after Laura disappeared. The buyer had taken it out of state. Investigators tracked the buyer. The truck no longer existed. It had been destroyed in a collision in 1996. No forensic evidence could be recovered. But investigators now had another possibility. Mercer may not have been driving his own vehicle. That could explain why some witnesses remembered a different truck. It could also explain why the original investigation failed to connect Mercer to the scene. Then detectives found the most disturbing part. Danner had never been interviewed in the original case. His name appeared nowhere in the primary suspect list. Not once. Yet records showed Mercer had called Danner twice on the night Laura disappeared. The first call was made shortly after midnight. The second came less than an hour later. There was no record of what they discussed. Danner had been working that evening, but his employer's records showed he left early. He told his supervisor he was sick. He never returned. For investigators, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Mercer, Danner, 2 men, 2 vehicles, 1 isolated road, 1 missing woman. But Danner was dead. Whatever he knew could never be recovered directly from him. Investigators searched his former property. The house had been demolished years earlier. The land had been sold. A new development stood there now. Still, detectives obtained permission to inspect a small section of undeveloped land behind the property. They brought ground-penetrating radar. They brought cadaver dogs. They brought the old maps. And they brought photographs of Laura. The first day produced nothing. The second day produced nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, 1 dog stopped beside a cluster of trees. The handler waited. The dog moved again, then returned to the same spot. Investigators marked the area. They dug carefully. The first layer contained roots, then stones, then old construction debris, then something metallic. A small object emerged from the soil. It was not a weapon. It was not a piece of clothing. It was a rusted metal clasp. Investigators compared it with photographs of Laura's missing overnight bag. The clasp was similar, but similarity was not identification. The laboratory examined it. No usable DNA. No fingerprints. No serial number. The object could have belonged to anyone. The search continued. A few feet away, investigators found a small fragment of blue plastic, then another piece of fabric. The fabric was badly degraded, but its color and weave were consistent with clothing Laura had been wearing that night. The discovery sent the case into another phase. The area was sealed. Every inch was mapped. Soil was collected. The investigators excavated slowly. They found animal bones, old bottles, pieces of machinery, a rusted shovel, but no human remains. Then one technician noticed something beneath a large route, a small piece of paper. It was almost completely destroyed. Only a few letters remained. The laboratory carefully stabilized it. The writing could not be fully reconstructed, but 2 words were still visible: Laura. And beneath it, a date: September 14th, the date Laura disappeared. The discovery was explosive, but investigators refused to declare it proof. The paper could have been planted. It could have been unrelated. It could have been written years later. Every possibility had to be considered. Still, Mercer reacted differently when investigators showed him a photograph of the recovered fragment. He became silent. Then he asked one question: "Where did you find that?" The detective did not answer. Mercer looked down. For the first time, investigators saw genuine fear in his face. Not anger. Not irritation. Fear. They asked him why the paper mattered. Mercer said nothing. They asked whether Danner had written it. Silence. They asked whether Laura had written it. Mercer shook his head. No. That single word changed everything. If Laura had not written it, who had? And why was her name on it? The detective asked Mercer again. Who wrote that? Mercer looked toward the camera. Then he whispered something almost impossible to hear. He did. Who? Mercer did not answer. The interview ended minutes later. Investigators were left with one terrifying possibility. Someone besides Mercer knew what happened. Someone who had never been arrested. Someone whose name had remained outside the case for decades. The detectives returned to the records. They searched every connection between Mercer and Danner. Old employment records, property transfers, telephone calls, bank statements, vehicle registrations. They found something buried in Danner's financial records: a payment, made in cash. The amount was not enormous, but the date was exact. September 15th, still 1989, the day after Laura vanished. The payment had no clear explanation. The recipient was a mechanic. Investigators tracked him down. He was 81. He remembered the transaction. Danner had brought him the pickup. The truck had been covered in mud. The interior had been damaged, and there was a strange smell inside. The mechanic had asked what happened. Danner told him he had hit a deer. The mechanic never believed him. He remembered cleaning the truck. He remembered replacing part of the carpet. And he remembered one more thing. A small silver object had been lying beneath the driver's seat. A star-shaped keychain. Laura's keychain. The same type recovered near her abandoned vehicle. The mechanic had thrown it away. He had no idea it would matter. 37 years later, investigators realized they had been following the wrong trail. They had spent decades looking for the place where Laura disappeared. But perhaps the real secret was hidden in the vehicles. The vehicles had moved. The evidence had moved. And someone had spent years making sure nothing remained. Mercer was confronted with the mechanic's statement. This time, he did not deny knowing Danner. He admitted Danner had helped him that night. But he insisted Danner was responsible for what happened afterward. What happened afterward? The detective asked. Mercer stared at the table. He took her. The words landed like a blow. Where? Mercer shook his head. I don't know. You're lying. Mercer looked up. No. The detective pushed forward. You expect us to believe you don't know? Mercer remained silent. Then he said something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. I thought she was dead. The detective froze. You thought? Mercer swallowed. I didn't see what happened. Then why did you run? Mercer did not answer. Why did you leave her car? Nothing. Why did you help clean the truck? Nothing. Why did you lie for 37 years? Mercer finally looked toward the photograph of Laura. His voice dropped. Because I was afraid of what he would do to me. The room went silent. For 37 years, investigators had believed they were hunting one killer. Now the evidence suggested there may have been another man, a dead man, a man who could no longer be questioned, a man whose secrets had disappeared with him. And if Mercer was telling the truth, then the arrest that had seemed to close the case had actually opened the darkest question yet. What had Carl Danner done with Laura Bennett after taking her away from that lonely Texas road? The name Carl Danner changed the investigation overnight. For 37 years, detectives had looked at Laura Bennett's disappearance as a single-person mystery. Now they were staring at the possibility of something more complicated. Mercer had finally admitted that Danner was involved. But investigators knew better than to accept his story without proof. A suspect who has been arrested has every reason to shift blame, every reason to minimize his own role, every reason to turn a dead man into the perfect scapegoat. So detectives began with the simplest question. Was Carl Danner actually capable of doing what Mercer claimed? They went back through his history. Not rumors, not assumptions, records. Danner had lived in the county for most of his life. He owned several properties. He worked around heavy equipment. He knew the back roads. He knew the drainage systems. He knew the abandoned hunting area. And according to people who knew him, he had a reputation for controlling everything around him. But investigators found no documented history of violent crime, no conviction for assault, no murder, no kidnapping, nothing that immediately explained Laura. That made the case more difficult. The investigators then examined Danner's relationship with Mercer. They had known each other for years. They had worked together. They had exchanged money. They had borrowed vehicles. They had visited the same property. But there was one detail that stood out. Danner had employed Mercer at a small repair operation on the edge of town. Laura's workplace had used that same company. Not directly, but occasionally. The connection was buried in old invoices. Mercer had been around Laura's workplace before. That meant he could have known her schedule. He could have recognized her. He could have known when she left. The theory that Laura was randomly selected was beginning to collapse. Investigators considered another possibility. Maybe Laura had recognized Mercer first. Maybe she knew him through work. Maybe she trusted him enough to speak with him at the diner. And maybe that trust was exactly what allowed him to get close. The detective assigned to the case reconstructed Laura's final evening on a large whiteboard. Every known movement, every telephone call, every witness, every vehicle, every minute. The timeline became increasingly narrow. Laura left work. She stopped at the store. She purchased the overnight bag. She went to the diner. She spoke with Mercer. She drove away. Mercer contacted Danner. A dark pickup appeared on the back road. Laura's car was later found abandoned. The cigarette evidence placed Mercer near the vehicle. The bracelet appeared near the canal. Danner's truck was taken to a mechanic the following day, and the vehicle was cleaned. Then came another discovery. Investigators found an old photograph from a local community event. It had been taken in 1988. Laura was in the background. So was Danner. He was standing near Mercer. The two men were talking. Laura was only several feet away. The photograph was not evidence of a crime, but it proved something important. Danner knew Laura. Mercer knew Laura. And the three had been in the same place before she disappeared. The defense argued that the photograph meant nothing. Investigators agreed. By itself, it meant nothing. But the case was no longer built around one piece. It was built around a chain. And chains become stronger when every link points in the same direction. The next breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a storage company. Danner had rented a storage unit in 1989. The company had changed owners several times. The original paper record should have been destroyed, but an old ledger had survived in a locked office. Investigators found Danner's name. The rental began months before Laura disappeared. The unit was small, about the size of a single-car garage. The record showed that Danner accessed it twice in the week after Laura vanished. Then never again. The unit had been abandoned. The contents were eventually sold. No inventory survived. But investigators tracked down the person who purchased the contents. He had died years earlier. His son remembered an old metal trunk. The trunk had been thrown away. But there were photographs. Old photographs. The son gave them to investigators. One photograph showed the inside of the storage unit. Boxes, tools, a rolled-up carpet, several plastic containers, and against the wall, a large dark object covered by a tarp. The photograph had been taken before the contents were sold. Investigators enlarged it. The object under the tarp was impossible to identify, but beneath it was something small, a handbag. The color looked similar to Laura's. The image was too poor to prove anything. Still, detectives searched Laura's belongings. Her mother had kept photographs of Laura's clothing. The purse Laura carried on the night she disappeared was brown leather. The object in the photograph appeared darker. It could have been anything. Another dead end. Or so it seemed. Then the investigators discovered that the storage unit had been emptied 3 days after Laura's disappearance. Danner had paid a man to help him. That man was still alive. He was located in another state. When detectives interviewed him, he remembered almost nothing. Then they mentioned the date. September 1989. His expression changed. He remembered Danner being nervous. He remembered the smell inside the unit. And he remembered a large carpet. He said Danner told him it had been damaged by oil. Investigators asked whether there had been blood. He said he did not know. He had never looked closely. But he remembered something else. Danner had told him not to open one of the containers. That container was never seen again. Investigators now had a possible location where evidence might have been stored. But the storage unit had been emptied decades earlier. The building had been demolished. The land had been redeveloped. Nothing remained. The trail was cold again. Then Mercer made another statement. He said Laura had been alive when he last saw her. That was the first time he had said it clearly. He claimed she was frightened. He claimed Danner was angry. He claimed they argued near the hunting property. Then Danner told Mercer to leave. Mercer said he obeyed. He drove away. But investigators noticed something. If Mercer had left, why was his DNA on evidence near Laura's vehicle? Why had he helped clean Danner's truck? Why had he lied for 37 years? Mercer finally offered an explanation. He said he had been afraid. He said Danner had threatened him. He said Danner told him that if he talked, his family would suffer. Investigators asked why he had never gone to police after Danner died. Mercer had no good answer. I thought nobody would believe me. The detective stared at him. You could have told the truth. Mercer lowered his head. I know. That answer did not absolve him. It made him more complicated. Mercer could be telling the truth. He could also be trying to save himself. Investigators needed something that existed outside his story, something Danner had left behind. They searched his financial history again. This time they found a payment made to a landfill company. September 17th. Sill 1989. 3 days after Laura disappeared. The amount was unusually high. The company no longer existed. A county records preserved its disposal log. Investigators obtained them. Most entries were routine. Construction debris. Household waste. Old machinery. Then they found Danner's name. A disposal load. Industrial waste. Large quantity. The location of the pickup was listed as the hunting property. The material had been transported to a landfill outside the county. The landfill had been closed years earlier. Part of it had been capped. Another section had become restricted woodland. Investigators obtained permission to search the older section. They brought in specialists, ground-penetrating radar, soil analysts, cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists. The search lasted days. Nothing. Then one technician found an anomaly beneath a layer of compacted soil, a long rectangular shape, approximately 6 feet in length. The area was marked. Excavation began. The first layer contained construction debris, then broken wood, then soil, then a plastic sheet. The investigators stopped. Every movement became careful. The sheet was removed. Underneath was more debris. No remains. Something was wrapped inside the plastic. A section of old carpet. Dark. Water damaged. Investigators photographed it. Samples were collected. The carpet appeared consistent with the type used in Danner's repair operation, but there was no way to prove it came from the truck. Then the laboratory found something. A microscopic trace. Not enough for a complete DNA profile, but human biological material was present. The investigators compared it with Laura's family reference samples. The result was inconclusive. Not a match. Not a rejection. Simply too degraded. Still, the discovery changed the search. Investigators expanded the excavation. Several feet away, they found another section of carpet. Then another. Different material. Same general area. It looked like someone had dumped discarded items over time. The possibility remained that the evidence was unrelated, but the timing was too close. Danner's disposal record, the hunting property, the storage unit, the truck, the carpet, the missing woman. Everything kept circling back to the same small group of people. Then the laboratory called again. They had found something on the carpet, a strand of hair. The root was gone. There was no nuclear DNA, but mitochondrial DNA could still provide information. The sample was compared with Laura's family line. The result was not conclusive, but it was consistent. That distinction mattered. Consistent did not mean identify. The prosecutor knew the defense would attack it immediately, but investigators now had another reason to believe the landfill deserved a deeper search. They returned with larger excavation equipment. The search moved slowly, layer by layer. Decades of soil were removed. Then, beneath the carpet fragments, investigators found something small, a piece of jewelry, a broken chain. Attached to it was a tiny metal star. Laura had owned a necklace with a star pendant. Her family had photographs. The necklace was missing from her belongings. The pendant looked similar, but the metal was heavily corroded. The engraving was almost impossible to read. Forensic technicians cleaned it carefully. One letter appeared, then another. The engraving formed a name, Laura. For the first time in 37 years, investigators were holding an object that appeared to have belonged to her. The discovery did not produce a body. It did not reveal how she died, but it moved the case closer than anyone had expected. And suddenly, the story Mercer had told about Danner began to look less like an excuse and more like a possibility. There may have been another man. There may have been another vehicle. There may have been another location. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Laura had not simply vanished. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase what happened to her. And if the old landfill still contained evidence after 37 years, investigators knew there might be one final place left to search. A place Mercer had mentioned only once. A place he had refused to discuss afterward. The abandoned well behind the hunting property. The abandoned well stood behind the hunting property, hidden beyond a wall of cedar and mesquite trees. For decades, nobody had paid much attention to it. The old landowner had called it useless, a dry stone shaft, too dangerous to approach, too old to repair. By 2026, most of the original structure had collapsed beneath weeds and brush. Only a circular concrete rim remained visible above the ground. But Daniel Mercer had mentioned it, only once. And when investigators asked him about it, he immediately stopped talking. That reaction was enough. Before sunrise the next morning, detectives returned to the property. The area was sealed. A forensic team arrived with climbing equipment, cameras, lighting rigs, and air monitoring devices. The well was deeper than expected, nearly 30 feet. At the bottom was mud, broken branches, rusting metal, decades of debris. A technician lowered a camera. The image disappeared into darkness. Then the light reached the bottom. Nothing obvious. No body. No clothing. No weapon. Just black water and stones. The camera was raised. Investigators were preparing to leave when the technician noticed something caught against the side of the shaft. A piece of fabric. Dark blue. The same color that had appeared repeatedly throughout the case. The team lowered the camera again. This time they saw more. A second piece of fabric. Then what appeared to be a section of plastic. The well was reopened for a full forensic search. Workers pumped out the remaining water. Mud was removed by hand. Every object was photographed before being moved. Old bottles came out first. Then broken tools. A rusted bucket. Animal bones. A piece of rope. And finally, something that made everyone stop. A small white sneaker. The size was consistent with Laura, but it was badly damaged. The sole was partly missing. The fabric had turned gray with age. Investigators compared it with photographs of the shoes Laura had worn that night. The design was similar. Not enough for identification. Still, another connection had appeared. The well was not empty. Something had been placed inside it. Something had been thrown there deliberately. The search continued. Several hours later, a technician uncovered a second shoe. This one was almost completely buried in sediment. Investigators carefully removed it. The pair appeared to match. Laura's family was shown photographs. Her sister immediately recognized them. She remembered buying the shoes with Laura months earlier, but investigators still needed forensic confirmation. The laboratory tested the material. Traces of biological material were present. The sample was degraded. There was no complete profile, but the mitochondrial DNA was consistent with Laura's maternal line. Again, the word was consistent. Not definitive, but now the evidence was accumulating. Laura's jewelry, possible clothing fragments, her shoes, the old carpet, the vehicle evidence, and the abandoned well. The case had changed. The question was no longer whether Laura had been taken somewhere. The question was, what had happened to her after she arrived at the property? Investigators returned to Mercer. This time, they did not tell him what they had found. They simply asked about the well. His reaction was immediate. He looked down. Then he said, "I told you I didn't know." The detective replied, "We never told you what we found." Mercer went silent. That moment was recorded. Every pause, every movement, every change in his expression. The detective asked again, "Why are you afraid of that?" Mercer leaned back. He rubbed his hands together. Then he whispered, "Because Danner used it." "For what?" Mercer did not answer. "Did he put Laura there?" Silence. "Did you see him?" Mercer closed his eyes. "I saw the truck." "What truck?" "Danner's." "When?" "The night she disappeared." "Where?" "Behind the property." The detective leaned forward. "What was in the truck?" Mercer stared at the floor. "I don't know. You just said you saw it." "I saw him unload something." "What?" Mercer shook his head. "I never went closer." The detective asked the question that had haunted the case for 37 years. Was Laura in that truck? Mercer remained silent for almost 20 seconds. Then he said, "I think so." That answer was not a confession, but it was devastating, because until that moment, Mercer had claimed he never knew what happened. Now he was placing Danner himself and Laura in the same chain of events. Investigators asked whether Mercer helped. He said no. They asked whether he touched Laura's car. He said he did not remember. They asked whether he helped clean Danner's truck. He admitted it. Then came the most important question. Why? Mercer looked exhausted. "Because he told me to." "Why would you obey him?" Mercer said nothing. The detective pushed harder. "Was he threatening you?" "Yes." "With what?" "My family." That was the explanation Mercer had given before. But investigators were not satisfied. They asked whether Danner had threatened anyone else. Mercer hesitated. Then he gave them a name. A woman. Someone who had worked with Danner. Someone who had known Laura. Her name was Elaine Foster. Elaine was still alive. She lived in another part of Texas. Investigators contacted her that afternoon. She agreed to speak. Her story changed the investigation again. Elaine had worked for Danner in 1989. She remembered Laura. She remembered Mercer. And she remembered something she had never told police. 2 weeks before Laura disappeared, Danner had asked her about Laura's schedule. He wanted to know when Laura worked, when she left, whether she drove home alone. Elaine thought the questions were strange. She refused to answer. But she remembered telling Laura that someone had been asking about her. Laura became nervous. She said she would handle it. Then she disappeared. Elaine had never contacted police because she was afraid. She had received a warning. A phone call. A man's voice. He told her to forget what she had heard. She did. For 37 years. Now she was finally speaking. Investigators asked whether she recognized the voice. She said she could not be certain, but she believed it was Danner. The case was beginning to reveal a disturbing possibility. Laura may have been targeted before the night she vanished. Danner may have been watching her. Mercer may have been involved in following her, and someone may have known exactly where she would be. Investigators searched Danner's old financial records again. They found payments to several individuals. Small amounts. Cash. Nothing that immediately appeared criminal. But one payment stood out. A week before Laura disappeared, Danner had paid a private investigator. The investigator was dead. His company had closed. But his surviving business partner remembered the assignment. He had been asked to photograph Laura, not investigate her. Photograph her. The investigator had taken several pictures outside Laura's workplace. He had also photographed her apartment. He told his partner the assignment seemed unusual, but he completed it. The photographs were gone, or so everyone believed. Then investigators discovered a box in the former investigator's storage archive. Inside were hundreds of undeveloped negatives. Most had nothing to do with Laura, but one envelope was marked with Danner's initials. The negatives were scanned. The images appeared. Laura, leaving work, walking toward her car, entering her apartment, standing outside the diner. The photographs had been taken days before her disappearance. The final image was particularly disturbing. Laura was standing beside her car. Someone was watching her from across the street. The photograph had been taken from inside another vehicle. The person behind the camera was close, very close. Investigators enlarged the reflection in Laura's window. A face appeared. Not clear, but recognizable enough to create a shock. Daniel Mercer, the same man who had spent 37 years denying that he knew Laura. The photograph did not prove murder, but it proved surveillance, and it changed the meaning of everything that followed. Mercer was no longer simply a man who happened to cross paths with Laura. He had been watching her, at least according to the photograph. Investigators confronted him. Mercer stared at the image. He said nothing. Then he finally spoke. Danner told me to. Why? He said she knew too much. What did she know? Mercer looked toward the detective. She found the records. What records? Mercer hesitated. Then he said something investigators had not expected. Names. What names? People who were getting paid. The room went silent. Laura may have discovered a hidden financial scheme. Danner may have been using his business to move money. Mercer may have been involved. And Laura may have discovered enough to become dangerous. Investigators searched the old medical supply company records again. This time they found unexplained inventory loss, medical equipment, controlled supplies, cash discrepancies. The losses had never been connected to Laura's disappearance, but the dates overlap, and several shipments were connected to companies associated with Danner. The case was suddenly larger than a missing woman. It involved a network of transactions that had disappeared beneath decades of paperwork, but investigators still needed proof that Laura knew about it. They found that proof in an old notebook. Laura had kept handwritten notes. Her mother had preserved them. Most were ordinary. Shopping lists, phone numbers, work reminders, but several pages near the end contained initials, dates, amounts of money. One sentence appeared twice. Someone is taking things. Another read, I don't trust him. There was no name, only a single initial, D. The investigators believed it could refer to Danner or someone else, but one date stood out. September 14th, the day Laura disappeared. Beside the date were 3 numbers. No explanation. No context. Just numbers. Investigators compared them with old shipment records. They matched the value of missing medical supply. Laura had apparently documented something, and she may have been preparing to report it. That could explain why someone was watching her. It could explain the questions about her schedule. It could explain the diner meeting. And it could explain why Mercer suddenly changed his story. But one question remained. Did Laura die because she discovered the scheme? Or was there another reason? Investigators returned to the well. The excavation continued. More material was recovered. A piece of clothing. A broken watch. A metal button. A fragment of plastic. None was immediately conclusive. Then the forensic team discovered something beneath the mud. A small metal box. It was sealed. Rust had fused the lid shut. The box was carefully transported to the laboratory. Inside were several objects. A wallet, a photograph, and a folded piece of paper. The wallet was badly damaged, but an identification card remained partially visible. The photograph showed Laura, alive, standing beside a man. The man was Carl Danner, and on the back of the photograph was a handwritten date, September 14th, Sill 1989, the same date Laura disappeared. The folded paper was opened under controlled conditions. Only a few words remained readable, but one sentence was clear enough to send a chill through the entire investigative team. Tell someone if I don't come home. The handwriting appeared to be Laura. For 37 years, her family had waited for evidence that she had known she was in danger. Now they had it. She had been afraid. She had tried to leave a warning, and someone had made sure that warning remained hidden. But the box contained one final object, a key. Small, silver, stamped with a number. Investigators traced the number. It belonged to a storage facility. Not Danner's old unit. Not Mercer's property. A different facility. One that had never appeared anywhere in the original investigation. The lease had been opened 3 days before Laura disappeared, and the name on the contract was not Carl Danner. It was Daniel Mercer. The storage unit changed everything. Until that moment, investigators had been working backward through a maze of damaged records, unreliable memories, dead suspects, demolished buildings, and evidence that had survived almost for decades. Now they had a physical location, a location rented under Daniel Mercer's name, a location opened 3 days before Laura Bennett disappeared, and a key recovered from a box hidden inside the abandoned well. The investigators did not rush. They knew the smallest mistake could destroy evidence that had survived since 1989. The storage facility still existed. The building had changed ownership several times, but the unit numbers remained. Records showed that the original unit had been rented for 6 months. Mercer's name appeared on the contract. His signature appeared beneath it. The rental began on September 11th, still 1989. Laura disappeared on September 14th. The unit was emptied on September 22nd. Then it was abandoned. For 37 years, nobody had opened the connection. Now detectives stood outside the same metal door. The lock had been replaced many times. The original contents were long gone. But investigators were not looking for the things inside. They were looking for the history of the unit. Who entered? Who paid? Who helped Mercer? Who accessed the facility during those critical days? The companies still had partial access log, not electronic, paper, handwritten. A clerk had recorded vehicle descriptions for large units. Most entries were ordinary. Mercer appeared twice. Danner appeared once. And another name appeared 3 times. A man named Victor Hale. Victor had worked at the facility. He was listed as the manager's assistant. He had died in 2014, but his personnel file contained a note. Mercer requested private access. Investigators looked closer. The note was dated September 15th, still 1989, the day after Laura vanished. Mercer had requested access before sunrise. Why? The clerk had written the reason. Moving equipment. But investigators knew Mercer did not own heavy equipment. Danner did. The question became whether Mercer had used the storage unit to hide something. They searched the facility's archived maintenance records. The unit had received an unusual service call. The lock had been replaced. The floor had been cleaned. The date? September 23rd. 1 day after Mercer emptied the unit. The cleaning contractor was still alive. Investigators found him. He remembered the job. He remembered the smell. He remembered that the floor had been covered with dark stains. He had assumed they were oil. He said Mercer had told him a container had leaked. But the contractor remembered another detail. There had been a section of carpet rolled against the wall. He had been told not to touch it. The carpet was gone by the time he arrived. Investigators asked whether he had noticed anything else. He thought for a long time. Then he said yes. A woman's earring. It was lying near the doorway. He had thrown it away. The case now had another possible connection to Laura. But again, there was no physical proof. The original storage unit had been cleared. The earring was gone. The carpet was gone. The cleaning records were all that remained. Yet the timeline was becoming increasingly precise. Laura disappeared on September 14th. Mercer accessed the unit before sunrise on September 15th. Danner's truck was cleaned. A disposal load was sent to the landfill. The storage unit was emptied. And within days, the physical evidence had been scattered. Investigators wondered whether the 2 men had planned it, or whether they were reacting to something that had happened unexpectedly. Mercer had claimed Laura's death was not planned, but his behavior suggested preparation. A storage unit rented before the disappearance. A vehicle available. A remote property. Access to a landfill. Access to the well. Too many preparations. Too many coincidences. The prosecutor began considering a second theory. Maybe the disappearance had been planned weeks earlier. Maybe the argument at the hunting property was only the final stage of a larger plan. Then investigators found the photograph. The private investigators' negatives showed Mercer following Laura before the disappearance. But another photograph existed. It had been taken from much farther away. Laura was entering the storage facility, not the unit. The facility itself. The photograph was dated September 12th, 2 days before she disappeared. She was carrying the small overnight bag, the same bag investigators believed had vanished with her. Why was Laura at the storage facility? That question was crucial, because until then, investigators had assumed Mercer had chosen the location. Now it appeared Laura had been there too. Maybe she had discovered the unit. Maybe she had confronted Mercer. Maybe she had been looking for something. Investigators searched Laura's notebook again. The numbers written beside September 14th were compared with storage records. They matched a unit number. Not Mercer's unit. A neighboring unit. Laura had apparently written down the location before her disappearance. The neighboring unit had belonged to Danner. That was the breakthrough. Danner had rented a unit directly beside Mercer's. Both units were opened within days of each other. Both were emptied shortly after Laura disappeared. And both were cleaned. Investigators obtained the surviving contract. Danner had rented the unit 6 weeks before Laura vanished. The reason listed was business storage. But the unit had been accessed only twice. Once by Danner. Once by Mercer. Then, after September 14th, both units were emptied. The investigators now believed Laura had discovered something inside. Perhaps the missing medical supply. Perhaps financial records. Perhaps something that connected Danner to a larger operation. They needed to know what she might have seen. The medical supply company had kept old inventory codes. Investigators compared those codes with shipping documents from Danner's company. A pattern emerged. Certain products were repeatedly reported missing. The same products appeared in invoices associated with Danner. The quantities were small enough to avoid immediate suspicion. But over time, the losses were significant. Laura had apparently noticed. She had written down dates, amounts, initials, and unit numbers. She may have been collecting evidence. Then someone discovered what she was doing. Investigators believe Danner confronted her. Mercer may have been used to monitor her. The diner meeting may have been an attempt to control the situation. But Laura did not disappear until later that night. Something happened between the diner and the hunting property. Investigators searched for witnesses. They found a retired truck driver who remembered passing a dark sedan and a pickup on the road. The vehicles were stopped. The driver remembered the sedan because its hazard lights were flashing. He remembered the pickup because the driver was standing outside. The sedan was Laura's. The pickup was Danner's. The truck driver had driven past without stopping, but he remembered seeing another person, a second man, standing behind the pickup. He could not identify him, but the height and build were consistent with Mercer. The timeline tightened again. Laura's car, Danner's truck, Mercer, all together, on the same isolated road. Within minutes of the disappearance, investigators asked Mercer about the truck driver. He denied being there. Then they showed him the old statement. He stopped speaking. Eventually, he said, "I was scared." The detective asked, "Of Danner?" Mercer nodded. "What did Danner have?" Mercer stared at the table. "Something that could destroy people." "What?" "Records." "What records?" "Names." Again, that word. Names. Investigators realized the financial scheme might explain the motive, but it still did not explain why Laura was killed, unless she had threatened to expose it. They searched for any record of Laura contacting law enforcement before her disappearance. There was none, but they found a draft letter in her apartment. It had never been mailed. The letter was addressed to the company owner. Laura wrote that she had found irregular shipments. She said someone had been altering inventory records. She said she was afraid. The final paragraph was unfinished. The letter ended in the middle of a sentence. Investigators compared the handwriting. It matched Laura's known writing. The letter was never sent. That meant Laura had intended to report something, but she never got the chance. The evidence now suggested that someone knew about the letter. The question was, how? Maybe Laura had told someone. Maybe someone had seen the draft. Maybe someone had been watching her. The private investigator's photographs suggested exactly that. Laura was being watched, and Mercer admitted he had been involved. The defense would later argue that Mercer was merely following Danner's order, but investigators believed Mercer had played a larger role. He had rented the storage unit. He had followed Laura. He had been near her car. His DNA had been found on evidence. He had helped clean the truck. He had lied for 37 years, and he knew about the hunting property. Even if Danner was responsible for Laura's death, Mercer was no innocent bystander. The prosecutor prepared charges accordingly, but the case still needed a final piece, a connection between the storage units and Laura. The investigators searched the old facility with ground-penetrating equipment. The current building had a concrete floor. Nothing could be excavated. But beneath the floor was an old drainage channel, a maintenance tunnel. It had been sealed decades earlier. Records showed the tunnel had been accessed on September 16, 1989. The access code was not recorded, but the maintenance worker had left a note. Unit 14, odor. Unit 14 was Danner's unit. The tunnel had been inspected because someone reported a smell. The worker opened the access panel. He found nothing, or at least, nothing he recorded. Investigators tracked down the worker. He was 90 years old. His memory was fragile, but when they mentioned the date, he remembered. He said there had been a plastic barrel. He remembered because he had complained about it. He said Mercer told him it contained chemical. The worker never opened it. The barrel disappeared days later. Where did it go? Investigators searched disposal record. Nothing. Then they found a transportation manifest. A chemical disposal company had collected one barrel from the facility. The pickup occurred on September 18th. The destination was an industrial waste site. That site had been closed, but unlike the old landfill, its records were preserved. Investigators obtained them. The manifest listed one barrel. Sender: Carl Danner. Receiver: Industrial Disposal Facility. Contents: unknown solvent. But there was a handwritten notation beneath it. Do not open. The investigators stared at the document. A barrel. A hidden tunnel. A storage unit. A warning. And a date for days after Laura disappeared. The company had destroyed its physical records decades ago, but the disposal site retained one final piece: a photograph. Workers had photographed hazardous containers before burial. The image was grainy. The barrel was black. A white number had been painted across it. Investigators enlarged the number. It matched the unit number Laura had written in her notebook. The case had just taken another terrifying turn. Laura had apparently discovered Danner's storage unit. She had written the number down. The barrel had been removed days after her disappearance, and someone had deliberately marked it. Investigators now had to determine what had been inside. They requested permission to excavate the old disposal site. The answer came back weeks later. The barrel was still there, buried beneath decades of soil, sealed, untouched, waiting. For the first time in 37 years, investigators had located something that might have remained exactly where it had been placed. And if that barrel contained what they feared, it could answer the question that had haunted Laura's family since 1989. Not only what happened to Laura, but where she went after the last person saw her alive. The excavation began before dawn. No press conference. No cameras. No announcement. Investigators wanted silence. They wanted the site untouched. They wanted every layer of soil removed without contamination. The disposal ground sat beyond an old industrial district, surrounded by weeds, rusted fencing, and trees that had grown tall enough to hide the original landfill boundary. In 1989, it had been an active waste facility. By 2026, almost nobody remembered what had been buried there, but the records remembered. And one record pointed directly to a barrel connected to Carl Danner. The team followed the old disposal map. The coordinates were approximate. The original survey had been done with equipment primitive by modern standard. The margin of error was several feet. They searched. Nothing. They widened the excavation. Still nothing. Then the ground changed. A metal detector produced a faint signal. The technician marked the spot. The soil was removed carefully. 6 inches. Then another 6. Then another. At approximately 5 feet below the surface, the shovel struck metal. Everyone stopped. A circular object appeared beneath the dirt, black, corroded. A number was still visible. The same number that had appeared on the old photograph. The barrel had been found. For several minutes, nobody touched it. The container had been underground for nearly 37 years. Its condition was unknown. The forensic team secured the area. A specialist examined the exterior. There were no obvious leaks. No visible markings except the number. The lid was heavily rusted. The barrel was lifted from the ground and placed inside a containment enclosure. The entire process was photographed. Then the lid was opened. Inside was sludge. Dark. Thick. Mixed with pieces of deteriorated plastic. There was no obvious human remains. At first, it looked like another dead end. Then a technician noticed something embedded near the bottom, a small piece of fabric. Blue, the same color that had appeared throughout the investigation. It was carefully removed. The laboratory compared the material with photographs of Laura's clothing. The weave was consistent with the fabric from a jacket Laura had been wearing the night she disappeared. But investigators needed more. They found a second fragment, then a button, then a small metal zipper pull. Each item was photographed. Each was cataloged. None alone could establish what happened, but the pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. The barrel was connected to Danner. The barrel was removed for days after Laura disappeared. The number matched Laura's notebook, and now the contents appeared to contain fragments of clothing consistent with her. The investigators returned to Mercer. This time, they had no photograph, no theory, no pressure. They simply placed the barrel's disposal record in front of him. Mercer looked at it. His face changed. The detective watched carefully. "You knew about this?" Mercer said nothing. "You knew Danner removed a barrel?" Silence. "You knew where it went?" Mercer lowered his eyes. "I knew he had one." "What was inside?" Mercer shook his head. "I never opened it." "But you knew." "I knew something was wrong." "What did Danner tell you?" Mercer took a breath. "He said it was evidence." "Evidence of what?" Mercer did not answer. The detective placed Laura's photograph beside the document. "Was she in that barrel?" Mercer looked at the photograph. "No." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. The detective leaned forward. "Then what happened to her?" Mercer closed his eyes. "I don't know." "You expect us to believe that?" "I never saw her after the road." You told us Danner took her." "I saw his truck." "You said you thought she was dead." Mercer remained silent. The detective waited. Finally, Mercer whispered, "She wasn't in the barrel." That statement was important, because it meant Mercer knew enough to rule something out. The investigators asked how. He refused to explain, but they continued. They showed him the photograph of the barrel. Mercer identified the number. He said it belonged to Danner's storage system. Then he admitted something else. The number was not only a storage reference, it was a code. Danner used numbers to identify shipments. The same numbers appeared on invoices. The same system had been used for stolen medical supplies. Laura had discovered it. She had written the number down. She had apparently understood what it meant. And someone had killed her to keep her quiet. But who? Mercer? Danner? Both. The investigators needed to separate the truth from Mercer's attempt to save himself. They asked him about the night at the hunting property. This time, Mercer gave a longer account. He said Laura arrived in her car. He said Danner had already been there. He said Laura was angry. She had brought papers. She wanted answers. She told Danner she knew about the missing supply. She threatened to go to the police. Danner became furious. Mercer said he tried to calm him. Laura left the building. She walked toward her car. Danner followed. Mercer claimed he stayed behind. Then he heard shouting. A car door slammed. He ran outside. Laura was standing beside her vehicle. Danner was there. Mercer said he saw Danner grab Laura. Then everything happened quickly. Laura fell. Mercer said he could not see exactly what happened. He said Danner told him to get the car. Mercer refused. Danner threatened him. Mercer finally helped move Laura's vehicle. That was the story. Investigators asked the obvious question. If you saw him attack her, why didn't you call police? Mercer stared at the table. Because I was afraid. Afraid of Danner? Yes. You were an adult man. Mercer nodded. I know. You could have saved her. Mercer said nothing. That silence became one of the most difficult moments in the investigation, because even if Mercer's story was true, it did not make him innocent. He had choices. He could have called police. He could have stopped Danner. He could have told Laura's family. Instead, he stayed silent. For 37 years. Investigators asked where Laura was taken. Mercer said Danner used a second vehicle, the dark pickup. He claimed Danner drove away with Laura. Mercer followed in Laura's car. They eventually abandoned it near the roadside. Then Mercer said he walked back to Danner's vehicle. The two men drove separately to the storage facility. That explained the abandoned car. It also explained why Mercer's DNA might have been inside it. But investigators still needed to know where Laura was taken. Mercer said he did not know. The detective asked him about the well. Mercer said Danner had gone there before. but he insisted Laura was never placed inside. Investigators asked about the landfill. Mercer denied knowing anything about the disposal. Then they asked about the barrel. Mercer looked away. He had it before that night. That statement was critical. If true, the barrel might have had nothing to do with Laura. The investigators returned to the disposal records. The barrel had been stored in Danner's unit before Laura disappeared. It had not been created afterward. That meant it could have contained stolen materials rather than human remains. The clothing fragments could have entered the barrel through contaminated waste. The evidence was significant, but it was not conclusive. Then the laboratory completed the DNA testing. One fabric fragment contained a degraded biological sample. The DNA was compared with Laura's family reference. The result was stronger than previous testing. It was consistent with Laura. But again, investigators were cautious. The sample did not establish when the fabric entered the barrel. It did not establish how Laura died. It did not establish who placed it there. Still, it was enough to make the barrel a central piece of evidence. The prosecutor believed it could demonstrate that Laura's belongings had been deliberately disposed of. The defense would argue contamination. The courtroom battle was coming. But investigators were still searching. They went back to the old disposal site. If the barrel had been dumped there, perhaps other items from the same shipment remained nearby. They searched the surrounding area. Within hours, they found a second object, a metal toolbox. Its surface was badly corroded. Inside were tools, a wrench, screwdrivers, a utility knife, and beneath them, a small plastic evidence bag. The bag contained paper. Most of it had dissolved, but one corner remained. There was handwriting, a single letter, D. The investigators compared the handwriting. It appeared similar to Danner's known writing. Still, forensic handwriting analysis could not establish certainty from such a small sample. The evidence was suggestive, not definitive. Then the technician found something else, a small brass key, stamped with a number. The same number appeared on the storage unit. Investigators realized the key was not from the unit itself. It belonged to a smaller lockbox inside Danner's storage unit. That lockbox had never been recovered. The question became where it had gone. Investigators searched Danner's former property. Nothing. They searched his surviving financial records. Nothing. Then they discovered a forgotten bank safety deposit box. Danner had rented it in 1987. The bank still had archived records. The box had been closed in 1990, but the contents were not destroyed. They had been transferred to a state storage facility because of unpaid fees. Investigators obtained a warrant. The box was opened. Inside were documents, cash, photographs, a second set of medical supply records, and a small cassette tape. The tape was labeled only with a date, September 13th, still 1989, one day before Laura disappeared. The investigators found an old cassette player. The recording began with static. Then a man's voice, Danner. His voice was confirmed through archived recording. The audio was not a confession. It was a conversation. Another person was present. A woman. Her voice was difficult to identify, but one sentence could be heard clearly. You said she wouldn't know. Danner responded. She knows now. The recording continued. The woman asked what would happen. Danner said, she won't talk. Then the recording ended. Investigators replayed it. Again and again. The words were unmistakable. Someone had discussed Laura before she disappeared. Someone knew she had discovered something. And someone believed she would not talk. But the woman on the tape remained unidentified. Investigators began voice comparison. They considered Elaine Foster. The voice did not match. They considered women who had worked with Danner. None matched conclusively. Then they looked at Laura's workplace. One employee stood out. A woman who had resigned suddenly 2 weeks after Laura disappeared. Her name was Susan Ward. She had never been considered a suspect. She had never appeared in the major investigative report. But she had access to inventory records. She knew about the missing supplies. And she had worked directly with Laura. Investigators tracked her down. Susan was alive. When detectives asked whether she knew Carl Danner, she denied it. They played the tape. Her expression changed. She listened. Then she began to cry. She said she had never wanted anyone to get hurt. Investigators asked the question that had remained unanswered for 37 years. What happened to Laura Bennett? Susan looked at the table. Then she whispered. Danner wasn't the only one who knew. The room went silent. She continued. There was another man. Who? Susan raised her eyes. Someone inside the company. The detective leaned forward. Give us his name. Susan hesitated. Then she said it. And the name was not Daniel Mercer. It was not Carl Danner. It was someone investigators had never placed on the suspect list. Someone who had been standing much closer to Laura than anyone realized. The name Susan Ward gave investigators belonged to a man who had spent 37 years living an ordinary life. His name was Richard Voss. In 1989, Voss was 41 years old. He was the inventory supervisor at the medical supply company where Laura worked. He had access to shipment records. He had access to storage rooms. He knew which products were missing. And more importantly, he knew Laura had started asking questions. For nearly 4 decades, nobody had connected his name to her disappearance. Not because investigators had cleared him, because they had never seriously considered him. The original case file contained only 2 references to Richard Voss. One was an employment record. The other was a brief interview conducted 3 days after Laura disappeared. He had told detectives Laura seemed normal at work. He said she had never mentioned being afraid. He said he knew nothing about missing supply. Then he returned to work. That was it. 37 years later, investigators were looking at him again. They found him living quietly in a neighboring state. Retired. Married. No major criminal record. No public connection to Laura. No obvious reason for suspicion. But Susan Ward's statement changed that. She told investigators Voss had been the person who first warned Danner about Laura. She said Voss had discovered that Laura was comparing inventory records. He had panicked. He knew she was getting close. And according to Susan, he contacted Danner. The detective asked why. Susan's answer was simple. Because Danner made problems disappear. That sentence became the center of the interview. Investigators asked what she meant. Susan explained that Danner had been purchasing stolen medical supplies through a network of intermediaries. The company would report products missing. The paperwork would be altered. The inventory numbers would be adjusted. Then the supplies would appear somewhere else. Laura noticed the pattern. She started keeping copies. She started writing down numbers. She started comparing shipments. Voss discovered what she was doing. He confronted her. Laura refused to stop. That was when Susan said Voss went to Danner. Investigators asked whether Susan knew what Danner intended to do. She said no. At least, not at first. Then came the night of September 13th. The cassette recording. Danner's voice. A woman's voice. You said she wouldn't know. She knows now. She won't talk. Susan admitted the woman was her. She had been on the tape. But she insisted she never wanted Laura harmed. She said Danner told her they would scare Laura. They would take her records. They would threaten her. Then everything would end. Susan said she believed him. Until the following night. Laura disappeared. The investigators asked Susan why she had never come forward. Her answer was devastating. Because she was afraid she would be next. She said Danner had shown her photographs of Laura, photographs of her apartment, photographs of Susan herself. He wanted them to understand that he knew where they lived. He knew where their families lived. He knew how to make people disappear. Whether every part of Susan's story was true remained uncertain. But investigators now had 3 people connected to Laura's final hour. Danner, Mercer, Voss. And Susan knew all 3. They began rebuilding the case again. Voss had access to Laura's workplace. Danner had access to the remote property. Mercer had followed Laura. Susan had been part of the conversation before the disappearance. The question was whether they had acted together. Investigators searched Voss's old records. His employment file showed something unusual. He had taken 3 days off immediately after Laura disappeared. He claimed he was sick. A payroll record showed he had traveled nearly 200 miles. Why? Investigators traced the route. It ended near an abandoned processing facility. The facility had been owned by a company connected to Danner. It had closed in the early 1990s. The building was still standing. Investigators obtained a warrant. Inside, they found old machinery, broken shelving, and layers of dust. Nothing appeared connected to Laura. Then a technician noticed a section of concrete floor that looked different. It had been poured over an older surface. The repair date was estimated to be late 1989. Investigators brought in ground-penetrating equipment. A rectangular anomaly appeared beneath the concrete. The area was excavated. They found a metal drum. It was empty, but the exterior had a faded marking, a number, the same number used in Danner's storage record. The investigators opened their evidence photographs. The marking matched. The drum had apparently been part of the same system, but the most important discovery came from the underside. There was a fragment of paper trapped beneath the rusted rim. It contained a partial inventory code. The code belonged to one of the medical products Laura had documented as missing. The investigators realized they were standing inside another part of the operation. The facility had been used to store stolen supplies. But was it connected to Laura's disappearance? They searched historical photographs. A picture from 1989 showed Danner's truck parked behind the building. Another photograph showed Mercer's truck nearby. And then came something unexpected. Voss appeared in the background. 3 men. 1 facility. 1 month before Laura vanished. The case was tightening. Investigators brought Voss in for questioning. He agreed to speak. At first, he denied knowing Danner well. Then they showed him the photograph. He stared at it. I knew him through business. You told police in 1989 that you barely knew him. I was trying to protect myself. From what? Voss looked away. From people who had more power than I did. Investigators asked about Laura. He said she had discovered irregular shipments. They asked whether he told Danner. He denied it. Then they played the cassette. Voss listened. His face became pale. That isn't me. We didn't say it was. Voss stopped. The detective watched him carefully. You know who that woman is? Voss said nothing. Then the detective placed Susan's statement on the table. Voss leaned back. For several seconds, he did not move. Finally, he said, Susan was there. Where? The night Laura disappeared. That was the first confirmation investigators had received from someone other than Susan. But Voss immediately changed direction. He claimed Susan had been the one who contacted Danner. He claimed Laura had threatened to expose the company. He claimed everyone was trying to protect themselves. The detective asked, Did you know Laura was going to be taken? Voss said no. Did you know Mercer was following her? No. Did you know Danner had a plan? No. Then why did you leave town the day after she disappeared? Voss hesitated. I was scared. Of what? Voss looked at the detective. Of what they had done. The room became silent. The detective asked the question slowly. What had they done? Voss did not answer. Then he said, I never saw her body. Investigators froze. They had not mentioned a body. They had not said Laura was dead. They had not told Voss what Mercer had said. Yet Voss had used the word body. The interview stopped. Prosecutors were immediately notified. Voss was now considered a major suspect. But investigators wanted to know whether he had knowledge that could only come from being involved. They searched his old property. The house had been renovated. The garage had been rebuilt. Most of the original structures were gone. But behind the property was a concrete-lined drainage ditch. Investigators found an old metal box buried beneath it. Inside were papers wrapped in plastic. Most were unreadable. One document survived. A handwritten list of inventory codes. Beside several codes were initials. D, R, M, and L. Investigators believed the initials could represent Danner, Richard Voss, Mercer, and Laura. But initials alone proved nothing. Then they found a date. September 14th, Sill 1989. Next to it was one final notation. Move before morning. The investigators stared at the page. The wording suggested preparation. Something was supposed to be moved. Something important. Something connected to the night Laura vanished. But the document did not say what. They searched for the person who had written it. Forensic handwriting experts compared the writing with Danner's known documents. The result was inconclusive. Then they compared it with Voss's handwriting. Again, inconclusive. The paper was too damaged. The ink had spread. No definitive identification could be made. But investigators found another clue. The plastic wrapping contained microscopic traces of soil. The soil composition was unusual. It contained a high concentration of limestone. The same soil was found near the old hunting property. That did not prove the document had been there, but it supported the possibility. The investigation returned to the same place again. The hunting property, the well, the storage units, the landfill. Every path seemed to lead back. Then investigators made a discovery that changed their understanding of Laura's final night. They found a forgotten telephone recorder. In 1989, the county had maintained an emergency dispatch system that automatically recorded some incoming call. Most recordings had been erased. One backup tape survived. The date was September 14th. Time, 1:58 a.m. A woman called. She was breathing heavily. She sounded frightened. The dispatcher asked for her name. The woman never answered. She said only, "I think someone is following me." The dispatcher asked where she was. The woman gave the name of a road. It was the same road where Laura's car was later found. Then the line went silent. The dispatcher asked if she could hear him. No answer. A few seconds later, the call disconnected. Investigators enhanced the recorder. The voice was compared with Laura's known recording. The preliminary result was extraordinary. The voice was consistent with Laura. Not enough for absolute identification, but strong enough to justify further analysis. If the call was really Laura, then she had been alive at 1:58 a.m. She knew someone was following her. She had been afraid. And she had tried to reach authorities. Yet nobody had connected that call to her disappearance, because the dispatch log had been filed under an incomplete location. The recording had been separated from the original case file. For 37 years, it had remained forgotten. Now investigators listened again. The final seconds contained something else. A sound. An engine. A door opening. Then Laura whispered one word. A name. The audio was damaged. The word was barely audible. But the forensic team isolated the syllable. They believed she said, "Richard." The room went silent. If the voice was Laura's, if the word was Richard, then the investigation had reached a terrifying point, because Richard Voss had spent 37 years denying he knew what happened. And now, an old emergency recording appeared to place his name on Laura's lips moments before she vanished.